Chapter 1. Perfumed Planet. Dane Thorson, Cargo Master Apprentice of the Solar Queen, Galactic Free Trader Spacer, Terra Registry, stood in the middle of the ship's cramped bather, while Rip Shannon, Assistant Astrogator and his senior in the service of trade by some 4 years, applied gobs of highly scented paste to the skin between Dane's rather prominent shoulder blades. The small cabin was thickly redolent with spicy odors, and Rip sniffed appreciatively. "You're sure going to be about the best-smelling Terran who ever set boot on Sargol's soil." His soft slur of speech ended in a rich chuckle. Dane snorted and tried to estimate the progress over one shoulder. "The things we have to do for trade." His comment carried a hint of present embarrassment. "Get it well in. This stuff's supposed to hold for hours. It'd better. According to Van, those Salariki can talk your ears right off your head and say nothing worth hearing. And we have to sit and listen until we get a straight answer out of them. Phew!" He shook his head. In such close quarters the scent, pleasing as it was also overpowering. "We would have to pick a world such as this." Rip's dark fingers halted their circular motion. "Dane," he warned, "don't you go talking against this venture. We got it soft, and we're going to be credit happy, if it works out." But, perversely, Dane held to a gloomier view of the immediate future. "If," he repeated. "There's a galaxy of ifs in this Sargol proposition. All very well for you to rest easy on your fins. You don't have to run about smelling like a spiceworks before you can get the time of day from one of the natives." Rip put down the jar of cream. "Different worlds, different customs." He iterated the old tag of the service. "Be glad this one is so easy to conform to. There are some I can think of. There." He ended his massage with a stinging slap. "You're all evenly greased. Good thing you don't have Van's bulk to cover. It takes him a good hour to get his cream on, even with Frank helping to spread. Your clothes ought to be steamed up and ready, too, by now." He opened a tight wall cabinet, originally intended to sterilize clothing which might be contaminated by contact with organisms inimical to Terrans. A cloud of steam, fragrant with the same spicy scent, poured out. Dane gingerly tugged loose his trade uniform, its brown silky fabric damp on his skin as he dressed. Luckily, Sargol was warm. When he stepped out on its ruby-tinted soil this morning, no lingering taint of his off-world origin must remain to disgust the sensitive nostrils of the Salariki. He supposed he would get used to this process. After all, this was the first time he had undergone the ritual. But he couldn't lose the secret conviction that it was all very silly. Only what Rip had pointed out was the truth. One adjusted to the customs of aliens, or one didn't trade, and there were other things he might have had to do on other worlds which would have been far more upsetting to that core of private fastidiousness which few would have suspected existed in his tall, lanky frame. "Phew! Out in the open with you!" Ollie Camille, apprentice engineer, screwed his 2 regular features into an expression of extreme distaste, and waved Dane by him in the corridor. For the sake of his shipmates' olfactory nerves, Dane hurried on to the port, which gave on the ramp now tying the Queen to Sargol's crust. But there he lingered, waiting for Van Ryck, the cargo master of the Spacer, and his immediate superior. It was early morning, and now that he was out of the confinement of the ship, the fresh morning winds cut about him, rippling through the blue-green grass forest beyond, to take much of his momentary irritation with them. There were no mountains in this section of Sargol, the highest elevations being rounded hills tightly clothed with the same 10-foot grass which covered the plains. From the Queen's observation ports, one could watch the constant ripple of the grass, so that the planet appeared to be largely clothed in a shimmering, flowing carpet. To the west were the seas, stretches of shallow water, so cut up by strings of islands that they more resembled a series of salty lakes. And it was what was to be found in those seas which had lured the Solar Queen to Sargol. Though by rights the discovery was that of another trader, Traxed Cam, who had bid for trading rights to Sargol, hoping to make a comfortable fortune, or at least expenses with a slight profit, in the perfume trade, exporting from the scented planet some of its more fragrant products. But once on Sargol, he had discovered the Koros stones, gems of a new type, a handful of which, offered across the board in one of the inter-planet trading marts, had nearly caused a riot among bidding gem merchants. And Cam had been well on the way to becoming one of the princes of trade when he had been drawn into the vicious net of the Limbian pirates and finished off. Because they too had stumbled into the trap which was Limbo, and had had a very definite part in breaking up that devilish installation. The crew of the Solar Queen had claimed as their reward the trading rights of Traxed Cam in default of legal heirs. So here they were on Sargol, with the notes left by Cam as their guide, and as much lore concerning the Salariki as was known crammed into their minds. Dane sat down on the end of the ramp, his feet on Sargolian soil, thin red soil with glittering bits of gold flake in it. He did not doubt that he was under observation from hidden eyes, but he tried to show no sign that he guessed it. The adult Salariki maintained at all times an attitude of aloof and complete indifference toward the traders, but the juvenile population were as curious as their elders were contemptuous. Perhaps there was a method of approach in that. Dane considered the idea. Van Ryck and Captain Jellicoe had handled the first negotiations, and the process had taken most of a day, the result totaling exactly nothing. In their contacts with the off-world men, the feline-ancestored Salariki were ceremonious, wary, and completely detached. But Cam had gotten to know them somehow, or he would not have returned from his first trip with that pouch of Koros stones. Only, among his records salvaged on Limbo, he had left absolutely no clue as to how he had beaten down native sales resistance. It was baffling. But patience had to be the middle name of every trader, and Dane had complete faith in Van. Sooner or later, the cargo master would find a key to unlock the Salariki. As if the thought of Dane's chief had summoned him, Van Ryck, his scented tunic sealed to his bull's neck in unaccustomed trimness, his cap on his blond head, strode down the ramp, broadcasting waves of fragrance as he moved. He sniffed vigorously as he approached his assistant, and then nodded in approval. "So, you're all greased and ready. Is the captain coming too, sir?" Van Ryck shook his head. "This is our headache. Patience, my boy, patience." He led the way through a thin screen of grass on the other side of the scorched landing field to a well-packed earth road. Again Dane felt eyes, knew that they were being watched. But no Salarik stepped out of concealment. At least they had nothing to fear in the way of attack. Traders were immune, taboo, and the trading stations were set up under the white diamond shield of peace, a peace guaranteed on blood oath by every clan chieftain in the district. Even in the midst of inter-clan feuding, deadly enemies met in amity under that shield and would not turn claw-knife against each other within a 2-mile radius of its protection. The grass forest rustled betrayingly, but the Terrans displayed no interest in those who spied upon them. An insect with wings of brilliant green gauze detached itself from the stalk of a grass tree and fluttered ahead of the traders, as if it were an official herald. From the red soil crushed by their boots arose a pungent odor, which fought with the scent they carried with them. Dane swallowed 3 or 4 times, and hoped his superior officer had not noticed that sign of discomfort. Though Van Ryck, in spite of his general air of sleepy benevolence and careless goodwill, noticed everything, no matter how trivial, which might have a bearing on the delicate negotiations of galactic trade. He had not climbed to his present status of expert cargo master by overlooking anything at all. Now he gave an order. "Take an equalizer." Dane reached for his belt pouch, flushing, fiercely determined inside himself that no matter how smells warred about him that day, he was not going to let it bother him. He swallowed the tiny pellet Medic Tau had prepared for just such trials, and tried to occupy his mind with the work to come. If there would be any work. Or would another long day be wasted in futile speeches of mutual esteem, which gave formal lip service to trade and its manifest benefits? "Oh!" The cry, which was half wail, half arrogant warning, sounded along the road behind them. Van Ryck's stride did not vary. He did not turn his head, show any sign he had heard that heralding fanfare for a clan chieftain. And he continued to keep to the exact center of the road, Dane the regulation 1 pace to the rear and left as befitted his lower rank. "Ow!" The blast from the throat of a Salariki, especially chosen for his lung power, was accompanied now by the hollow drum of many feet. The Terrans neither looked around nor withdrew from the center, nor did their pace quicken. That, too, was an order, Dane knew. To the rank-conscious Salariki clansman, you did not yield precedence unless you wanted at once to acknowledge your inferiority. And if you did that by some slip of admission or omission, there was no use in trying to trade face-to-face with their chieftains again. "Ow!" The blast behind was a scream as the retinue it announced swept around the bend in the road to catch sight of the 2 traders oblivious of it. Dane longed to be able to turn his head, just enough to see which of the local lordlings they blocked. "Ow!" There was a questioning note in the cry now, and the heavy thud-thud of feet was slacking. The clan party had seen them, were hesitant about the wisdom of trying to shove them aside. Van Ryck marched steadily onward, and Dane matched his pace. They might not possess a leather-lunged herald to clear their road, but they gave every indication of having the right to occupy as much of it as they wished. And that unruffled poise had its effect upon those behind. The pound of feet slowed to a walk which would keep a careful distance behind the 2 Terrans. It had worked. The Salariki, or the Salariki, were accepting them at their own valuation, a good omen for the day's business. Dane's spirits rose, but he schooled his features into a mask as wooden as his superiors. After all, this was a very minor victory, and they had 10 or 12 hours of polite and hidden maneuvering before them. The Solar Queen had set down as closely as possible to the trading center marked on Traxcam's private map, and the Terrans now had another 5 minutes' march, in the middle of the road, ahead of the chieftain who must be inwardly boiling at their presence, before they came out in the clearing containing the roofless, circular erection which served the Salariki of the district as a marketplace and a common meeting ground for truce talks and the mending of private clan alliances. Erect on a pole in the middle, towering well above the nodding fronds of the grass trees, was the pole bearing the trade shield, which promised not only peace to those under it, but a 3-day sanctuary to any feuder or duelist who managed to win to it and lay hands upon its weathered standard. They were not the first to arrive, which was also a good thing. Gathered in small groups about the walls of the council place were the personal attendants' liege warriors, and the younger relatives of at least 4 or 5 clan chieftains. But Dane noted at once there was not a single curtain litter or riding orgle to be seen. None of the feminine part of the Salariki species had arrived. Nor would they until the final trade treaty was concluded and established by their fathers, husbands, or sons. With the assurance of one who was master in his own clan, Van Ryck, displaying no interest at all in the shifting mass of lower-ranked Salariki, marched straight on to the door of the enclosure. 2 or 3 of the younger warriors got to their feet, their brilliant cloaks flicking out like spreading wings. But when Van Ryck did not even lift an eyelid in their direction, they made no move to block his path. As fighting men, Dane thought, trying to study the specimens before him with a totally impersonal stare, the Salariki were an impressive lot. Their average height was close to 6 feet, their distant feline ancestry apparent only in small vestiges. A Salaric's nails on both hands and feet were retractile. His skin was gray, his thick hair, close to the texture of plushy fur, extended down his backbone and along the outside of his well-muscled arms and legs, and was tawny yellow, blue-gray, or white. To Terran eyes, the broad faces, now all turned in their direction, lacked readable expression. The eyes were large and set slightly aslant in the skull, being startlingly orange-red or a brilliant turquoise-green-blue. They wore loincloths of brightly dyed fabrics with wide sashes forming corselets about their slender middles, from which gleamed the gem-set hilts of their claw knives, the possession of which proved their adulthood. Cloaks as flamboyant as their other garments hung in bat-wing folds from their shoulders, and each and every one moved in an invisible cloud of perfume. Brilliant as the assemblage of liegemen without had been, the gathering of clan leaders and their upper officers within the council place was a riot of color and odor. The chieftains were installed on the wooden stools, each with a small table before him on which rested a goblet bearing his own clan sign, a folded strip of patterned cloth, his trade shield, and a gemmed box containing the scented paste he would use for refreshment during the ordeal of conference. A breeze fluttered sash ends and tugged at cloaks. Otherwise, the assembly was motionless and awesomely quiet. Still making no overtures, Van Ryck crossed to a stool and table which stood a little apart and seated himself. Dane went into the action required of him. Before his superior he set out a plastic pocket flask, its color as alive in the sunlight as the crudely cut gems which the Salariki sported, a fine silk handkerchief, and, last of all, a bottle of Terran smelling salts, provided by Medic Tau as a necessary restorative after some hours' combination of Salariki oratory and Salariki perfumes. Having thus done the duty of a liegeman, Dane was at liberty to seat himself cross-legged on the ground behind his chief, as the other sons, heirs, and advisers had gathered behind their lords. The chieftain, whose arrival they had in a manner delayed, came in after them, and Dane saw that it was Fashdor, another piece of luck, since that clan was a small one and the chieftain had little influence. Had they so slowed Halfer or Paft, it might be a different matter altogether. Fashdor was established at his seat, his belongings spread out, and Dane, counting unobtrusively, was certain that the council was now complete. 7 clans, Traxt Cam had recorded, divided the sea-coast territory, and there were 7 chieftains here. Indicative of the importance of this meeting, since some of these clans, beyond the radius of the shield piece, must be fighting a vicious blood feud at this very moment. Yes, 7 were here. Yet there still remained a single stool, directly across the circle from Van Ryck. An empty stool. Who was the latecomer? That question was answered almost as it flashed into Dane's mind. But no Salariki lordling came through the door. Dane's self-control kept him in his place, even after he caught the meaning of the insignia emblazoned across the newcomer's tunic. Traitor. And not only a traitor, but a company man. But why? And how? The companies only went after big game. This was a planet thrown open to free traders, the independents of the star lanes. By law and right, no company man had any place here. Unless... Behind a face Dane strove to keep as impassive as Van's, his thoughts raced. Traxed Cam as a free trader had bid for the right to exploit Sargol when its sole exportable product was deemed to be perfume, a small, unimportant trade as far as the companies were concerned. And then the Koro stones had been found, and the importance of Sargol must have boomed as far as the big boys could see. They probably knew of Traxed Cam's death as soon as the patrol report on Limbo had been sent to headquarters. The companies all maintained their private information and espionage services. And, with Traxed Cam dead, without an heir, they had seen their chance and moved in. Only, Dane's teeth set firmly, they didn't have the ghost of a chance now. Legally, there was only one trader on Sargol, and that was the Solar Queen. Captain Jellicoe had his records signed by the patrol to prove that. And all this intersolar man would do now was to bow out and try poaching elsewhere. But the IS man appeared to be in no haste to follow that only possible course. He was seating himself with arrogant dignity on that unoccupied stool, and a younger man in IS uniform was putting before him the same type of equipment Dane had produced for Van Ryck. The cargo master of the Solar Queen showed no surprise, if the IZ's appearance had been such to him. One of the younger warriors in Paff's train got to his feet and brought his hands together with a clap which echoed across the silent gathering with the force of an archaic solid projectile shot. A Salariki, wearing the rich dress of the upper ranks, but also the collar forced upon a captive taken in combat, came into the enclosure carrying a jug in both hands. Preceded by Paff's son, he made the rounds of the assembly, pouring a purple liquid from his jug into the goblet before each chieftain, a goblet which Paff's heirs tasted ceremoniously before it was presented to the visiting clan leader. When they passed before Van Ryck, the Salariki nobleman touched the side of the plastic flask in token. It was recognized that off-world men must be cautious over the sampling of local products, and that when they joined the taking of the first cup of peace, they did so symbolically. Paff raised his cup, his gesture copied by everyone around the circle. In the harsh tongue of his race, he repeated a formula so archaic that few of the Salariki could now translate the sing-song words. They drank, and the meeting was formally opened. But it was an elderly Salariki seated to the right of Halfer, a man who wore no claw-knife, and whose dusky yellow cloak and sash made a subdued note amid the splendor of his fellows, who spoke first, using the click-clack of the trade lingo his nation had learned from Cam. "Under the white," he pointed to the shield aloft, "we assemble to hear many things. But now come two tongues to speak where once there was but one father of a clan. Tell us, Outlanders, which of you must we now hark to in truth?" He looked from Van Ryck to the IS representative. The cargo master from the Queen did not reply. He stared across the circle at the company man. Dane waited eagerly. What was the IS going to say to that? but the fellow did have an answer ready and waiting. "It is true, fathers of clans, that here are two voices, where by right and custom there should only be one. But this is a matter which can be decided between us. Give us leave to withdraw from your sight and speak privately together. Then he who returns to you will be the true voice, and there shall be no more division." It was Paft who broke in before Halfer's spokesman could reply. "It would have been better to have spoken together before you came to us. Go, then, until the shadow of the shield is not. Then return hither and speak truly. We do not wait upon the pleasure of outlanders." A murmur approved that tart comment. Until the shadow of the shield is not. They had until noon. Van Ryck arose, and Dane gathered up his chief's possessions. With the same superiority to his surroundings he had shown upon entering, the cargo master left the enclosure, the Izies following. But they were away from the clearing, out upon the open road back to the Queen before the two from the company caught up with them. "Captain Grange will see you right away," the Izie cargo master was beginning when Van Ryck met him with a quelling stare. "If you poachers have anything to say, you say it at the Queen and to Captain Jellicoe," he stated flatly, and started on. Above his tight tunic collar, the other's face flushed. His teeth flashed as he caught his lower lip between them, as if to forcibly restrain an answer he longed to make. For a second he hesitated, and then he vanished down a side path with his assistant. Van Ryck had gone a quarter of the distance back to the ship before he spoke. "I thought it was too easy," he muttered. "Now we're in for it. Maybe right up the rockets. By the spike-tail of Exal, this certainly is not our lucky day." He quickened pace until they were close to trotting. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Rivals. "That's far enough, Izie." Although traders, by law and tradition, carried no more potent personal weapons, except in times of great crisis, than hand sleep rods, the resultant shot from the latter was just as unpleasant for temporary periods as a more forceful beam, and the threat of it was enough to halt the three men who had come to the foot of the Queen's ramp, and could see the rod held rather negligently by Ollie. Ollie's eyes were anything but negligent, however, and free traders had reputations to be respected by their rivals of the companies. The very nature of their roving lives taught them savage lessons, which they either learned or died. Dane, glancing down over the engineer apprentice's shoulder, saw that Van Ryck's assumption of confidence had indeed paid off. They had left the trade enclosure of the Salariki barely 3/4 of an hour ago, but below now stood the debadged captain of the IS ship and his cargo master. "I want to speak to your captain," snarled the Izie officer. Ollie registered faint amusement, an expression which tended to rouse the worst in the spectator, as Dane knew of old when that same mocking appraisal had been turned on him as the rawest of the Queen's crew. "But does he wish to speak to you?" countered Camille. "Just stay where you are, Izie, until we are sure about that fact." That was his clue to act as messenger. Dane retreated into the ship and swung up the ladder to the command section. As he passed Captain Jellicoe's private cabin, he heard the muffled squall of the commander's unpleasant pet, Queeks, the Hoobat, a nightmare combination of crab, parrot, and toad, wearing a blue feather coating and inclined to scream and spit at all comers. Since Queeks would not be howling in that fashion if its master was present, Kane kept on to the control cabin, where he blundered in upon an executive-level conference of Captain, Cargo Master, and Astrogator. "Well?" Jellicoe's blaster-scarred left cheek twitched as he snapped that impatient inquiry at the messenger. "Easy captain below, sir, with his Cargo Master. They want to see you." Jellicoe's mouth was a straight line, his eyes very hard. By instinct, Dane's hand went to the grip of the sleep rod slung at his belt. When the old man put on his fighting face, look out. Here we go again, he told himself, speculating as to just what type of action lay before them now. "Oh, they do they?" Jellicoe began, and then throttled down the temper he could put under iron control when and if it were necessary. "Well, tell them to stay where they are. Van, we'll go down." For a moment the Cargo Master hesitated. His heavy-lidded eyes looked sleepy. He seemed almost disinterested in the suggestion. And when he nodded, it was with the air of someone about to perform some boring duty. "All right, sir." He wriggled his heavy body from behind the small table, resealed his tunic, and settled his cap with as much precision as if he were about to represent the Queen before the assembled nobility of Sargol. Dane hurried down the ladders, coming to a halt beside Ollie. It was the turn of the man at the foot of the ramp to bark an impatient demand. "Well?" Was that the theme word of every captain's vocabulary? "You wait," Dane replied, with no inclination to give the easy officer any courtesy address. Close to a Terran year aboard the Solar Queen had inoculated him with pride in his own section of service. A free trader was answerable to his own officers and to no one else on Earth, or among the stars, no matter how much discipline and official etiquette the companies used to enhance their power. He half expected the IS officers to leave after an answer such as that. For a company captain to be forced to wait upon the convenience of a free trader must be galling in the extreme. And the fact that this one was doing just that was an indication that the Queen's crew did, perhaps, have the edge of advantage in any coming bargain. In the meantime, the IZ contingent fumed below, while Ollie lounged, whistling against the exit port, playing with his sleep rod, and Dane studied the grass forest. His boot nudged a packet just inside the port casing, and he glanced inquiringly from it to Ollie. "Cat ransom," the other answered his unspoken question. So that was it, the fee for Sinbad's return. "What is it today?" "Sugar, about a tablespoonful," the engineer assistant returned, "and 2 colored stelos. So far they haven't run up the price on us. I think they're sharing out the spoil evenly. A new cub brings him back every night." As did all Terran ships, the Solar Queen carried a cat as an important member of the regular crew. And the portly Sinbad, before their landing on Sargol, had never presented any problem. He had done his duty of ridding the ship of unusual and usual pests and cargo despoilers with dispatch, neatness, and energy, and when in port on alien worlds had never shown any inclination to go a-roving. But the sense of Sargol had apparently intoxicated him, shearing away his solid dignity and middle-aged dependability. Now Sinbad flashed out of the Queen at the opening of her port in the early morning, and was brought back, protesting with both voice and claws, at the end of the day by that member of the juvenile population whose turn it was to collect the standing reward for his forceful delivery. Within 3 days it had become an accepted business transaction which satisfied everyone but Sinbad. The scrape of metal boot soles on ladder rungs warned of the arrival of their officers. Ollie and Dane withdrew down the corridor, leaving the entrance open for Jellicoe and Van Ryck. Then they drifted back to witness the meeting with the IZs. There were no prolonged greetings between the two parties, no offer of hospitality, as might have been expected between Terrans on an alien planet a quarter of the galaxy away from the Earth which had given them a common heritage. Jellicoe, with Van Ryck at his shoulder, halted before he stepped from the ramp, so that the three intersolar men, captain, cargo master, and escort, whether they wished or no, were put in the disadvantageous position of having to look up to a captain whom they, as members of one of the powerful companies, affected to despise. The lean, well-muscled, trim figure of the Queen's commander gave the impression of hard-bitten force held in check by will control, just as his face, under its thick layer of space burn, was that of an adventurer accustomed to make split-second decisions, an estimate underlined by that seam of blaster burn across one flat cheek. Van Ryck, with a slight change of dress, could have been a company man in the higher ranks, or so the casual observer would have placed him, until an observer marked the eyes behind those sleepy drooping lids, or caught a certain note in the calm, unhurried drawl of his voice. To look at the two senior officers of the free-trading spacer were the antithesis of each other. In action, they were each half a powerful steamroller whole. As a good many men in the service, scattered over a half-dozen or so planets, had discovered to their cost in the past. Now Jellicoe brought the heels of his space boots together with an extravagant click, and his hand flourished at the fore of his helmet in a gesture which was better suited to the patrol hero of a slightly out-of-date video serial. "Jellicoe, Solar Queen, Free Trader," he identified himself brusquely, and added, "This is Van Ryck, our cargo master." Not all the flush had faded from the face of the IS captain. "Grange of the Dart." He did not even sketch a salute. "Intersolar. Callie, cargo master." And he did not name the hovering third member of his party. Jellicoe stood waiting, and after a long moment of silence, Grange was forced to state his business. "We have until noon." Jellicoe, his fingers hooked on his belt, simply waited, and under his level gaze the IZ captain began to find the going hard. "They gave us until noon," he started once more, "to get together." Jellicoe's voice came, coldly remote. "There is no reason for any getting together, Grange. By rights, I can have you up before the Trade Board for poaching. The Solar Queen has sole trading rights here. If you up ship within a reasonable amount of time, I'll be inclined to let it pass. After all, I've no desire to run all the way to the nearest patrol post to report you." "You can't expect to buck intersolar. We'll make you an offer." That was Callie's contribution, made probably because his commanding officer couldn't find words explosive enough. Jellicoe, whose forte was more direct action, took an excursion into heavy-handed sarcasm. "You IZs have certainly been given excellent briefing. I would advise a little closer study of the code, and not all the sections in small symbols at the end of the tape, either. We're not bucking anyone. You'll find our registration for Sargol down on tapes at the center, and I suggest that the sooner you withdraw the better, before we cite you for illegal planeting." Grange had gained control of his emotions. "We're pretty far from center here," he remarked. It was a statement of fact, but it carried overtones which they were able to assess correctly. The Solar Queen was a free trader, alone on an alien world, but the IS ship might be cruising in company, ready to summon aid, men and supplies. Dane drew a deep breath. The IZs must be sure of themselves. Not only that, but they must want what Sargol had to offer to the point of being willing to step outside the law to get it. The IS captain took a step forward. "I think we understand each other now," he said, his confidence restored. Van Ryck answered him, his deep voice cutting across the sighing of the wind in the grass forest. "Your proposition?" Perhaps this return to their implied threat bolstered their belief in the infallibility of the company, their conviction that no independent dared stand up against the might and power of the Intersolar. Callie replied, "We'll take up your contract, and a profit to you, and you up ship before the Salariki are confused over whom they're to deal with." "And the amount of the profit?" Van Ryck bored in. "Oh," Callie shrugged, "say 10% of Cam's last shipment." Jellicoe laughed. "Generous, aren't you, Izzy? 10% of a cargo which can't be assessed? The gang on Limbo kept no records of what they plundered." "We don't know what he was carrying when he crashed on Limbo," countered Callie swiftly. "We'll base our offer on what he carried to Axel." Now Van Ryck chuckled. "I wonder who figured that one out," he inquired of the scented winds. "He must save the company a fair amount of credits one way or another. Interesting offer." By the bland satisfaction to be read on the three faces below, the IS men were assured of their victory. The Solar Queen would be paid off with a pittance. Under the vague threat of company retaliation, she would upship from Sargol, and they would be left in possession of the rich Koros trade, to be commended and rewarded by their superiors. Had they, Dane speculated, ever had any dealings with free traders before, at least with the brand of independent adventurers such as manned the Solar Queen? Van Ryck burrowed in his belt pouch and then held out his hand. On the broad palm lay a flat disk of metal. "Very interesting," he repeated. "I shall treasure this recording." The sight of that disk wiped all satisfaction from the icy faces. Grange's purplish flush spread up from his tight tunic collar. Callie blinked, and the unknown third's hand dropped to his sleep rod. An action which was not overlooked by either Dane or Ollie. "A smooth set-down to you." Jellicoe gave the conventional leave-taking of the service. "You'd better," the icy captain began hotly, then seeing the disk Van Ryck held, that sensitive bit of metal and plastic which was recording this interview for future reference, he shut his mouth tight. "Yes?" the Queen's cargo master prompted politely. But Callie had taken his captain's arm and was urging Grange away from the spacer. "You have until noon to lift," was Jellicoe's parting shot as the three in company livery started toward the road. "I don't think that they will," he added to Van Ryck. The cargo master nodded. "You wouldn't in their place," he pointed out reasonably. "On the other hand, they've had a bit of a blast they weren't expecting. It's been a long time since Grange heard anybody say no." "A shock which is going to wear off." Jellicoe's habitual distrust of the future gathered force. "This," Van Ryck tucked the disk back into his pouch, "sent them off vector a parsec or two. Grange is not one of the strong-arm blaster boys. Suppose Tang Ya does a little listening in, and maybe we can rig another surprise, if Grange does try to ask advice of someone off-world. In the meantime, I don't think they are going to meddle with the Salariki. They don't want to have to answer awkward questions if we turn up a patrol ship to ask them. So," he stretched and beckoned to Dane, "we shall go to work once more." Again 2 paces behind Van Ryck, Dane tramped to the trade circle of the Salariki clansmen. They might have walked out only 5 or 6 minutes of ship time before, and the natives betrayed no particular interest in their return. But, Dane noted, there was only one empty stool, one ceremonial table in evidence. The Salariki had expected only one Terran trader to join them. What followed was a dreary round of ceremony, an exchange of platitudes and empty good wishes and greetings. No one mentioned Koro stones, or even perfume bark, that he was willing to offer the off-world traders. None lifted so much as a corner of his trade cloth, under which, if he were ready to deal seriously, his hidden hand would meet that of the buyer, so that by finger pressure alone they could agree or disagree on price. But such boring sessions were part of trade, and Dane, keeping a fraction of attention on the speeches and drinkings together, watched those around him with an eye which tried to assess and classify what he saw. The keynote of the Salariki character was a wary independence. The only form of government they would tolerate was a family clan organization. Feuds and deadly duels between individuals and clans were the accepted way of life, and every male who reached adulthood went armed and ready for combat until he became a speaker of the past, too old to bear arms in the field. Due to the nature of their battling lives, relatively few of the Salariki ever reached that retirement. Short-lived alliances between family members sometimes occurred, usually when they were to face a common enemy greater than either. But a quarrel between chieftains, a fancied insult, would rip that open in an instant. Only under the trade shield could 7 clans sit this way without their warriors being at one another's furred throats. An hour before sunset, Paff turned his goblet upside down on his table, a move followed speedily by every chieftain in the circle. The conference was at an end for that day, and as far as Dane could see, it had accomplished exactly nothing, except to bring the Izies into the open. What had Traxt Cam discovered which had given him the trading contract with these suspicious aliens? Unless the men from the Queen learned it, they could go on talking until the contract ran out and get no farther than they had today. From his training, Dane knew that oft-times contact with an alien race did require long and patient handling. But between study and experiencing the situation himself there was a gulf, and he thought somewhat ruefully that he had much to learn before he could meet such a situation with Van Ryck's unfailing patience and aplomb. The cargo master seemed in nowise tired by his wasted day, and Dane knew that Van would probably sit up half the night, going over for the 100th time Traxt Cam's sketchy recordings in another painstaking attempt to discover why and how the other free trader had succeeded where the Queen's men were up against a stone wall. The harvesting of Koro stones was, as Dane and all those who had been briefed from Cam's records knew, a perilous job. Though the rule of the Salariki was undisputed on the land masses of Sargol, it was another matter in the watery world of the shallow seas. There the Gorp were in command of the territory, and one had to be constantly alert for attack from the sly reptilian intelligence, so alien to the thinking processes of both Salariki and Terran that there was, or seemed to be, no point of possible contact. One went gathering Koros gems after balancing life against gain. And perhaps the Salariki did not see any profit in that operation. Yet Traxt Cam had brought back his bag of gems. Somehow he had managed to secure them in trade. Van Ryck climbed the ramp, hurrying on into the Queen as if he would not get back to his records soon enough. But Dane paused and looked back at the grass jungle a little wistfully. To his mind, these early morning hours were the best time on Sargol. The light was golden, The night winds had not yet arisen. He disliked exchanging the freedom of the open for the confinement of the spacer. And, as he hesitated there, 2 of the juvenile population of Sargol came out of the forest. Between them they carried one of their hunting nets, a net which now enclosed a quiet but baneful-eyed captive, Sinbad, being delivered for nightly ransom. Dane was reaching for the pay to give the captors when, to his real astonishment, one of them advanced and pointed with an extended forefinger claw to the open port. "Go in," he formed the trade lingo words with care. And Dane's surprise must have been plain to read, for the cub followed his speech with a vigorous nod and set one foot on the ramp to underline his desire. For one of the Salariki, who had continually manifested their belief that Terrans and their ship were an offense to the nostrils of all right living men, to wish to enter the spacer was an astonishing about-face. But any advantage, no matter how small, which might bring about a closer understanding must be seized at once. Dane accepted the growling Sinbad and beckoned, knowing better than to touch the boy. "Come." Only one of the junior clansmen obeyed that invitation. The other watched, big-eyed, and then scuttled back to the forest when his fellow called out some suggestion. He was not going to be trapped. Dane led the way up the ramp, paying no visible attention to the young Salarick, nor did he urge the other on when he lingered for a long moment or two at the port. In his mind, the cargo-master apprentice was feverishly running over the list of general trade goods. What did they carry which would make a suitable and intriguing gift for a small alien with such a promising bump of curiosity? If he had only time to get to Van Ryck. The Salarick was inside the corridor now, his nostrils spread, assaying each and every odor in this strange place. Suddenly his head jerked, as if tugged by one of his own net ropes. His interest had been riveted by some scent his sensitive senses had detected. His eyes met Dane's in appeal. Swiftly the Terran nodded, and then followed with a lengthened stride as the Salarick sped down into the lower reaches of the Queen, obviously in quest of something of great importance. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Contact at Last. What in... Frank Mura, steward, storekeeper, and cook of the Queen, retreated into the nearest cabin doorway as the young Salarick flashed down the ladder into his section. Dane, with the now resigned Sinbad in the crook of his arm, had tailed his guest and arrived just in time to see the native come to an abrupt halt before one of the most important doors in the spacer, the portal of the hydro garden which renewed the ship's oxygen and supplied them with fresh fruit and vegetables to vary their diet of concentrates. The Salarick laid one hand on the smooth surface of the sealed compartment and looked back over his shoulder at Dane with an inquiry to which was added something of a plea. Guided by his instinct, that this was important to them all, Dane spoke to Mura. "Can you let him in there, Frank?" It was not sensible. It might even be dangerous. But every member of the crew knew the necessity for making some sort of contact with the natives. Mura did not even nod, but squeezed by the Salarick and pressed the lock. There was a sign of air, the crisp smell of growing things, lacking the languorous perfumes of the world outside, puffed into the faces. The cub remained where he was, head up, his wide nostrils visibly drinking in that smell. Then he moved with the silent, uncanny speed which was the heritage of his race, darting down the narrow aisle toward a mass of greenery at the far end. Sinbad kicked and growled. This was his private hunting ground, the preserve he kept free of invaders. Dane put the cat down. The Salariki had found what he was seeking. He stood on tiptoe to sniff at a plant, his yellow eyes half closed, his whole stance spelling ecstasy. Dane looked to the steward for enlightenment. "What's he so interested in, Frank?" "Catnip." "Catnip?" Dane repeated. The word meant nothing to him, but Mura had a habit of picking up strange plants and cultivating them for study. "What is it?" "One of the Terran mints, an herb." Mura gave a short explanation as he moved down the aisle toward the alien. He broke off a leaf and crushed it between his fingers. Dane, his sense of smell largely deadened by the pungency with which he had been surrounded by most of that day, could distinguish no new odor. But the young Salariki swung around to face the steward, his eyes wide, his nose questing. And Sinbad gave a whining yowl and made a spring to push his head against the steward's now aromatic hand. So, now they had it, an opening wedge. Dane came up to the three. "All right to take a leaf or two?" he asked Mura. "Why not? I grow it for Sinbad. To a cat it is like hemel smoke, or a tankard of Lacabad." And by Sinbad's actions, Dane guessed that the plant did hold for the cat the same attraction those stimulants produced in human beings. He carefully broke off a small stem supporting 3 leaves and presented it to the Salariki, who stared at him, and then, snatching the twig, raced from the hydro garden as if pursued by feuding clansmen. Dane heard the pad of his feet on the ladder. Apparently the cub was making sure of escape with his precious find. But the cargo-master apprentice was frowning. As far as he could see, there were only 5 of the plants. "That's all the catnip you have?" Mura tucked Sinbad under his arm and shooed Dane before him out of the hydro. "There was no need to grow more. A small portion of the herb goes a long way with this one." He put the cat down in the corridor. "The leaves may be preserved by drying. I believe that there is a small box of them in the galley." A strictly limited supply. Suppose this was the key which would unlock the Koros trade. And yet it was to be summed up in 5 plants and a few dried leaves. However, Van Ryck must know of this as soon as possible. But to Dane's growing discomfiture, the cargo-master showed no elation as his junior poured out the particulars of his discovery. Instead, there were definite signs of displeasure to be read by those who knew Van Ryck well. He heard Dane out, and then got to his feet. Tolling the younger man with him by a crooked finger, he went out of his combined office-living quarters to the domain of medic Craig Tau. "Problem for you, Craig." Van Ryck seated his bulk on the wall jump seat Tau pulled down for him. Dane was left standing just within the door, very sure now that instead of being commended for his discovery of a few minutes before, he was about to suffer some reprimand. And the reason for it still eluded him. "What do you know about that plant Mura grows in the hydro, the one called catnip?" Tau did not appear surprised at that demand. The medic of a free trading spacer was never surprised at anything. He had his surfeit of shocks during his first years of service, and after that accepted any occurrence, no matter how weird, as matter of fact. In addition, Tau's hobby was magic, the hidden knowledge possessed and used by witch doctors and medicine men on alien worlds. He had a library of recordings, odd scraps of information, of certified results of certain very peculiar experiments. Now and then he wrote a report, which was sent into Central Service, read with raised eyebrows by perhaps 6 incredulous desk-warmers, and filed away to be safely forgotten. But even that had ceased to frustrate him. "It's an herb of the mint family, from Terra," he replied. "Mira grows it for Sinbad. It has quite a marked influence on cats. Frank's been trying to keep him anchored to the ship by allowing him to roll in fresh leaves. He does it, then continues to sneak out whenever he can." That explained something for Dane. Why the Salariki cub wished to enter the Queen tonight. Some of the scent of the plant had clung to Sinbad's fur, had been detected, and the Salarick had wanted to trace it to its source. "Is it a drug?" Van Ryck prodded. "In the way that all herbs are drugs. Human beings have dosed themselves in the past with a tea made of the dried leaves. It has no great medicinal properties. To felines it is a stimulation, and they get the same satisfaction from rolling in and eating the leaves as we do from drinking." "The Salariki are, in a manner of speaking, felines," Van Ryck mused. Tao straightened. "The Salariki have discovered catnip, I take it." Van Ryck nodded at Dane, and for the second time the cargo-master apprentice made his report. When he was done, Van Ryck asked a direct question of the medical officer. "What effect would catnip have on a Salarick?" It was only then that Dane grasped the enormity of what he had done. They had no way of gauging the influence of an off-world plant on an alien metabolism. What if he had introduced to the natives of Sargol a dangerous drug, started that cub on some path of addiction? He was cold inside. Why, he might even have poisoned the child. Tao picked up his cap, and after a second's hesitation, his emergency medical kit. He had only one question for Dane. "Any idea of who the cub is? What clan he belongs to?" And Dane, chill with real fear, was forced to answer in the negative. What had he done? "Can you find him?" Van Ryck, ignoring Dane, spoke to Tao. The medic shrugged. "I can try. I was out scouting this morning, met one of the storm priests who handles their medical work. But I wasn't welcomed. However, under the circumstances, we have to try something." In the corridor, Van Ryck had an order for Dane. "I suggest that you keep to quarters, Thorson, until we know how matters stand." Dane saluted. That note in his superior's voice was like a whiplash, much worse to take than the abuse of a lesser man. He swallowed as he shut himself into his own cramped cubby. This might be the end of their venture. And they would be lucky if their charter was not withdrawn. Let IS get an inkling of his rash action, and the company would have them up before the board to be stripped of all their rights in the service. Just because of his own stupidity, his pride in being able to break through where Van Ryck and the captain had faced a stone wall. And, worse than the future which could face the Queen, was the thought that he might have introduced some dangerous drug into Sargol with his gift of those few leaves. When would he learn? He threw himself down on his bunk and despondently pictured the string of calamities which could, and maybe would, stem from his thoughtless and hasty action. Within the Queen, night and day were mechanical. The lighting in the cabins did not vary much. Dane did not know how long he lay there, forcing his mind to consider his stupid action, making himself face that in the service there were no shortcuts which endangered others, not unless those taking the risks were Terrans. "Dane!" Rip Shannon's voice cut through his self-imposed nightmare. But he refused to answer. "Dane! Van wants you on the double." Why? To bring him up before Jellicoe, probably. Dane schooled his expression, got up, pulling his tunic straight, still unable to meet Rip's eyes. Shannon was just one of those he had let down so badly. But the other did not notice his mood. "Wait till you see them. Half Sargol must be here yelling for trade." That comment was so far from what he had been expecting that Dane was startled out of his gloomy thoughts. Rip's brown face was one wide smile. His black eyes danced. It was plain he was honestly elated. "Get a move on, fire rockets," he urged, "or Van will blast you for fair." Dane did move, up the ladder to the next level and out on the port ramp. What he saw below brought him up short. Evening had come to Sargol, but the scene immediately below was not in darkness. Blazing torches advanced in lines from the grass forest, and the portable floodlight of the spacer added to the general glare, turning night into noonday. Van Ryck and Jellicoe sat on stools facing at least 5 of the 7 major chieftains with whom they had conferred to no purpose earlier, and behind these leaders milled a throng of lesser Salariki. Yes, there was at least one carrying chair, and also an orgel, from the back of which a veiled noblewoman was being assisted to dismount by 2 retainers. The women of the clans were coming, which could mean only that trade was at last in progress. But trade for what? Dane strode down the ramp. He saw Paft, his hand carefully covered by his trade cloth, advance to Van Ryck, whose own fingers were decently veiled by a handkerchief. Under the folds of fabric their hands touched. The bargaining was in the first stages, and it was important enough for the clan leaders to conduct themselves, where, according to Cam's records, it had been usual to delegate that power to a favored liegeman. Catching the light from the ship's beam and from the softer flares of the Salariki torches was a small pile of stones resting on a stool to one side. Dane drew a deep breath. He had heard the Koros stones described, had seen the 3D print of one found among Cam's recordings, but the reality was beyond his expectations. He knew the technical analysis of the gems, that they were, as the amber of Terra, the fossilized resin exuded by ancient plants, maybe the ancestors of the grass trees, long buried in the saline deposits of the shallow seas where chemical changes had taken place to produce the wonder jewels. In color they shaded from a rosy apricot to a rich mauve, but in their depths other colors, silver, fiery gold, spun sparks which seemed to move as the gem turned. And, which was what first endeared them to the Salariki, when worn against the skin and warmed by body heat, they gave off a perfume which enchanted not only the Sargolian natives, but all in the galaxy wealthy enough to own one. On another stool placed at Van Ryck's right hand, as that bearing the Koros stones was at Paft's, was a transparent plastic box containing some wrinkled brownish leaves. Dane moved as unobtrusively as he could to his proper place at such a trading session, behind Van Ryck. More Salariki were tramping out of the forest, torch-bearing retainers and cloaked warriors. A little to one side was a third party Dane had not seen before. They were clustered about a staff which had been driven into the ground, a staff topped with a white streamer marking a temporary trading ground. These were Salariki right enough, but they did not wear the colorful garb of those about them. Instead, they were all clad alike in muffling, sleeved robes of a drab green, the storm priests, their robes denoting the color of the Sargolian sky just before the onslaught of their worst tempests. Cam had not left many clues concerning the religion of the Salariki, but the storm priests had, in narrowly defined limits, power, and their recognition of the Terran traders would add to good feeling. In the knot of storm priests a Terran stood, Medic Tau, and he was talking earnestly with the leader of the religious party. Dane would have given much to have been free to cross and ask Tau a question or two. Was all this assembly the result of the discovery in the hydro? But even as he asked himself that, the trade cloths were shaken from the hands of the bargainers, and Van Ryck gave an order over his shoulder. "Measure out 2 spoonfuls of the dried leaves into a box." He pointed to a tiny plastic container. With painstaking care, Dane followed directions. At the same time, a servant of the Salariki chief swept a handful of gems from the other's stool and dropped them in a heap before Van Ryck, who transferred them to a strongbox resting between his feet. Paft arose, but he had hardly quitted the trading seat before one of the lesser clan leaders had taken his place, the bargaining cloth ready looped loosely about his wrist. It was at that point that the proceedings were interrupted. A new party came into the open. Their utilitarian trade tunics made a drab blot as they threaded their way in a compact group through the throng of the Salariki. IS men. So they had not lifted from Sargol. They showed no signs of uneasiness. It was as if their rights were being infringed by the free traders. And Callie, their cargo master, swaggered right to the bargaining point. The chatter of Salariki voices was stilled. The Sargolians withdrew a little, letting one party of Terrans face the other, sensing drama to come. Neither Van Ryck nor Jellicoe spoke. It was left to Callie to state his case. "You've crooked your orbit this time, bright boys." His jeer was a pain of triumph. "Code 3, Article 6, or can't you absorb rules tapes with your thick heads?" Code 3, Article 6. Dane searched his memory for that law of the service. The words flashed into his mind as the auto-learner had planted them during his first year of training back in the pool. To no alien race shall any trader introduce any drug, food, or drink from off-world until such a substance has been certified as non-harmful to the aliens. There it was. IS had them, and it was all his fault. But if he had been so wrong, why in the world did Van Ryck sit there trading, condoning the error, and making it into a crime for which they could be summoned before the board and struck off the rolls of the service? Van Ryck smiled gently. "Code 4, Article 2, he quoted with the genial air of one playing gift-giver at a Forkidian feasting. "Code 4, Article 2. Any organic substance offered for trade must be examined by a committee of trained medical experts, an equal representation of Terrans and aliens." Callie's sneering smile did not finish. "Well," he challenged, "where's your board of experts?" "Tau," Van Ryck called to the medic with the storm priests, "will you ask your colleague to be so kind as to allow the cargo master Callie to be presented?" The tall, dark, young Terran medic spoke to the priest beside him, and together they came across the clearing. Van Ryck and Jellicoe both arose and inclined their heads in honor to the priests, as did the chief with whom they had been about to deal. "Reader of clouds and master of many winds," Tau's voice flowed with the many-voweled titles of the Sargolian, "may I bring before your face Cargo Master Callie, a servant of Intersolar in the realm of trade?" The storm priest's shaven skull and body gleamed steel-gray in the light. His eyes, of that startling blue-green, regarded the IS party with cynical detachment. "You wish of me?" Plainly, he was one who believed in getting down to essentials at once. Callie could not be overawed. "These free traders have introduced among your people a powerful drug which will bring much evil." He spoke slowly in simple words, as if he were addressing a cub. "You have evidence of such evil?" countered the storm priest. "In what manner is this new plant evil?" For a moment, Callie was disconcerted, but he rallied quickly. "It has not been tested. You do not know how it will affect your people." The storm priest shook his head impatiently. "We are not lacking in intelligence, traitor. This plant has been tested. both by your master of life's secrets and ours. There is no harm in it. Rather, it is a good thing, to be highly prized, so highly that we shall give thanks that it was brought unto us. This speech together is finished." He pulled the loose folds of his robe closer about him and walked away. "Now," Van Ryck addressed the IS party, "I must ask you to withdraw. Under the rules of trade, your presence here can be actively resented." But Callie had lost little of his assurance. "You haven't heard the last of this. A tape of the whole proceedings goes to the board." "As you wish. But in the meantime—" Van Ryck gestured to the waiting Salariki, who were beginning to mutter impatiently. Callie glanced around, heard those mutters, and made the only move possible, away from the Queen. He was not quite so cocky, but neither had he surrendered. Dane caught at Tao's sleeve and asked the question which had been burning in him since he had come upon the scene. "What happened? About the catnip?" There was a lightening of the serious expression on Tao's face. "Fortunately for you, that child took the leaves to the Storm Priest. They tested and approved it. And I can't see that it has any ill effects. But you were just lucky, Thorson. It might have gone another way." Dane sighed. "I know that, sir," he confessed. "I'm not trying to rock it out." Tao gave a half-smile. "We all off-fire our tubes at times," he conceded. "Only next time—" He did not need to complete that warning as Dane caught him up. "There isn't going to be a next time like this, sir. Ever." End of Chapter 3.